Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and we're going to have a great discussion today about the Great Depression. And our guest is well equipped to talk to us about it. He's an economist, he's an historian, he is the President Emeritus, Humphreys Family Senior Fellow, and Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty Foundation for Economic Education, Lawrence W. Reed. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your having me again. This is a great topic.
So I really want to delve into what caused the Great Depression, what exacerbated the Great Depression, and ultimately what got us out of the Great Depression. But before I can answer that, before you can answer that for us, I want you to answer what exactly is the Great Depression. And the reason I ask, let me just give you a little background, is because we have the stock market crash of 1929. Then there was times during the 30s where it seemed that the depression was ending, and then it went back in and then out. So what is the Great Depression if you had to define it in terms of what it was and how long it lasted?
Okay. The Great Depression was an extended period of economic decline and stagnation at best for quite a few years. It wasn't the first downturn in American economic history. We'd had cycles before, and the troughs of those cycles, in some cases, were quite severe. But this one is called the Great Depression because it lasted 3 to 4 times longer than any of the previous depressions, and was also considerably deeper as measured by such things as the unemployment rate. So not the first, but it was the greatest in that it lasted from 1929 until, well, I like to say 1945. Some people say, oh, it was over with the beginning of World War II, and maybe we can address that issue. But I don't think that's accurate. I think it really was a 16-year depression, and the longest that any previous one in our history had lasted was 3 to 4 years.
All right. So as far as causes, we're going to look to the 20s for a second. Now, I was influenced in my thinking by 2 strands of economists, the Milton Friedman Chicago school and the Hayek von Mises Austrian school.
Mm-hmm.
I lend credence to the Austrians primarily, the arguments are strong in my view anyways, but also Hayek and Mises predicted the Great Depression, whereas Friedman's mentor, Irving Fisher, did not.
That's right.
He actually took a bath in the Great Depression, as did Keynes. So the Austrians argue, and Benjamin Anderson argues as well, that the 20s, there was a boom in the 20s that was fueled by easy money policy. The Coolidge administration, for instance, they were whipping up markets with their comments. The Federal Reserve is said to have had an easy money policy that ultimately led to the crack up boom in Austrian parlance in the subsequent crash. Milton Friedman argues no. His argument is that Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Fed, actually did a good job of managing the money supply in the 1920s, that upon his death, incompetent leadership was put in place, in that at the advent of the Great Depression, the money supply fell, I believe, by 2/3, and it may be a third, I might have the number wrong, but it was 1 or 2/3. But that the Fed just allowed it to drop without intervening and injecting cash. And in fact, they actually were raising interest rates as the money supply declined. Who's right?
I'm an Austrian, so I'm partial to the perspective that Mises, Hayek, Rothbard gave us. And I do see a very improvident, artificial expansion of money and credit engineered by the Federal Reserve in the 1920s as the major cause of the Great Depression. Milton Friedman is not so wrong if you pick him up at, let's say, 1930 through 33, because as he pointed out, once the Depression began, the Federal Reserve exacerbated it by fostering a deliberate and substantial deflation by contracting the money supply dramatically. And I don't think if the market was in charge of money that you would have seen that phenomenon. That was a direct result of the political manipulation of money and credit by the authorities at the Federal Reserve. So there are good arguments on both sides, but I think the Austrians get the cause of the Great Depression far more accurately than Friedman does, but Friedman does a decent job explaining why it got worse once it began.
So, but I want to get the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, but before I get to that, I want to address the Keynesian explanation.
Yes.
So Keynes essentially attempts to refute Say's law. Say's law of markets is that supply creates its demand when the economy is in equilibrium. It sounds crazy because people assume what it means is that, and I don't think Say actually used that language. People assume it means that whatever you produce is going to have a demand, but it's not that. It's just that the only means by which we have to demand anything in an economy is with supply. That unless you have first produced, there's nothing to consume, and you have nothing with which to trade. Keynes says no, that the possibility of general overproduction is possible, meaning that basically in all sectors of the economy, there's too much produced, and that you have to ultimately have a crash to sort of sop it up. Why is Keynes wrong?
Well, of course, if overproduction was the cause of the Depression, then we should be having a massive one today because we're producing a lot more today than we did back in the 1920s. I think that Keynes did not fully understand what Say was saying with Say's law.
Nice pun.
Yeah, Say was assuming that you have a free price system to equilibrate supply and demand. And you're right, Michael, it's not economic demand for somebody to just sit there and say, hey, I'd like to have something. I want dinner tonight. I mean, that's not demand. You got to be in the market with something to offer in exchange, which is why Say said that your supply offered in trade constitutes your demand for other things. I don't think Keynes fully understood that, but Keynes may have also been motivated as much by a political agenda of growing government as he was by economic truth. I'm not certain of that, but that's a possibility. He wouldn't have been the first to have a political agenda color his economics. We had a largely free economy in the 1920s. I mean, there was government interference, there were tariffs and some other things, but by and large, prices were free to adjust to changing conditions of supply and demand. And so when that doesn't happen, you have to, I think, not assume that the market's not working, because it'll always work. People aren't going to sit on a supply of something and not exchange it. They'll cut the price until somebody buys it. But I think that's not properly accounted for in the economics of John Maynard Keynes, whom we now know was wrong on so many things. He captured the economic world for a few decades, but we now know that a lot of Keynesian economics was just cooked up and unsound.
I mean, Benjamin Anderson smoked him, showed he was wrong, that he misunderstood Say's law. Henry Hazlitt's book, The Failure of Keynesian Economics, is just phenomenal. It's basically a page-by-page refutation.
He picks them apart almost line by line.
Yeah, so for anybody out there that's interested in the topic, I'd recommend reading both Keynes' General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and then after that, read Henry Hazlitt's The Failure of Keynesian Economics, or The Failure of the New Economics, rather. Okay, so what is the Austrian theory of the trade cycle, and why do you think it better explains the precipitation of the Great Depression?
Yes. The Austrian theory begins by suggesting rather strongly, and I think irrefutably, that cyclical behavior in the economy, economy-wide, not particular industries. I mean, obviously in agriculture, you have a natural cycle, right? There's a lot of activity at planting time and then a lot of activity at harvest time. There's kind of a boom and bust, you might say, but that's not a general economy-wide cycle. Austrians begin by suggesting that the cycle that we are usually focused on is not the result of some inherent flaw or flaws in the marketplace, but rather originates outside the market in the form of intervention by monetary authorities in the creation of money and credit. And they note that typically the boom phase of these cycles begins when monetary authorities, and in our case that would be the Federal Reserve, begin for whatever reason or reasons to expand money and credit. And you see the immediate effects of that by interest rates going down. Banks are flush with funds. They're trying to push the money out the door. And so they cut the price or the interest rate. And at lower interest rates, Austrians point out that that has very dramatic effects. It prompts capital goods industries to borrow the newly created money at depressed interest rates. And later, when we have the day of reckoning and all this comes crashing down, it's the capital goods industries that typically suffer the most because they were stimulated the most in the short term by the expansion of money and credit. It's sort of like, and this is not original with me, lots of people have drawn this analogy. It's a little like the drunk who goes to a party. He's not drunk yet, I guess, but a guy who goes to a party and he drinks like a fish and staggers home at 2 a.m. and wakes up a few hours later with a horrific headache and a hangover. You wouldn't say, if you stumbled upon the drunk as he's in the midst of his hangover, you wouldn't say that he was doing damage to himself at that moment. You'd have to say, wait a minute, you're just paying for the harm that you caused. The damage was being done the night before when you were having a great time. And we're just simply paying for it, or he is, when it all begins to wear off. In the economy, you do get a kind of temporary artificial stimulus, at least for some industries, capital goods in particular, when the banks become flush with newly created money and interest rates are artificially depressed. People run out and borrow that money and put it to work. But then later, unless the monetary authorities just keep blowing up the supply until you get a hyperinflation, at some point, they typically then say, oh, we've overdone it. We're going to have to back off. Let's raise interest rates to choke off all this hyperactivity. And then the economy comes crashing down. So the cycle is caused by the intervention of monetary authorities. And even Milton Friedman would largely agree with that. His prescription is different from what the Austrians would advise. Friedman would say, well, take the discretion out of monetary authorities' hands so they can't increase the money supply by 20% this year and then decrease it by 20% next year or something in between. Austrians really don't put much confidence in any kind of central planning, monetary or otherwise. So we think that the marketplace should be in charge of things like money and credit through private institutions and a free price system, just as we would argue the same for just about every other aspect of the economy, product or service.
So to me, the Austrian theory, it's the explanatory power of it as well as the logical rigor and just the plain elegance of it makes it phenomenal. So let me just explain how I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
In Austrian economics, and by and large, when I say Austrian, I'm referring to Mises because I know there's differences among some of them. But Mises's essential theory is that the subjective values, the subjective evaluations of market participants with marginal utility, sort of in operation, all the participants in the market decide what's going to be produced, what's going to be consumed, and the prices to be paid for it.
Yeah.
So the price that comes about as a result of subjective value and marginal utility, it's a signal to entrepreneurs about what needs to be produced and where they should direct their economic activity. That, of course, goes back to the socialist calculation debate. But the interest rate measures something a little bit different. It measures the time preference of people. So all things remaining equal, people want a satisfaction now.
Yeah.
So the higher the interest rate goes, it's an indication that time preference is high, right? So you have to pay people more money, a higher rate, in order to get them to save. Whereas the lower the interest rate is, time preference is low, people are willing to wait for their, to satisfy their wants. So in a free economy, what Mises called the originary interest, it measures time preference. So if I'm a capitalist, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I see that the interest rate is low, the signal that's sent to me, in the same way that prices are sending signals to me, the signal tells me that people do not want stuff now. They're willing to wait. So the capitalists, the entrepreneurs, direct production toward future consumption rather than present consumption. So they start projects, whether they be building hospitals or they invest in capital goods, for long-term production of. Did I say hospitals? I meant houses. Houses, things of that nature, things for future consumption. The problem is that interest rate, once the government injects money into the economy, it artificially lowers the rate, creating a false signal. So when entrepreneurs and capitalists now direct toward future consumption, they're misreading the market. And that stuff, ultimately, when there's no capital left and there's nobody there to consume that stuff, the prices crash. Is that a correct summary of the Austrian theory?
Yes, I think you got it right. The only thing I would add is that every one of us has his own time preference.
Right.
And those time preferences determine such things as our willingness to save or unwillingness to save. Some people that live for the present, they don't think about tomorrow, and so they come upon a little extra income, they spend all of it. And somebody else who's a little more future oriented, whose time preference is a little longer, or they have some interest in the future rather than everything for the present, they will save, and there'll be more savings made available naturally in the marketplace for capital goods industries to borrow. So the injection by the monetary authorities represents a kind of artificial non-market stimulus, only in the short term, by the way. It doesn't represent an increase in people's savings. It simply represents the desire of monetary authorities, perhaps reflecting the political authorities, to goose the economy in the short run. You're right that we falsify signals in the marketplace in the form of interest rates when government intervenes and depresses interest rates by flooding the banks with newly created money.
All right. So a difference, and we're going to move on from the 20s soon, I promise, but I just want to get this in. A difference between Austrians and Milton Friedman. The Austrians suggest that when money is injected into the economy, it isn't evenly spread, right? So if I get the money first, all the prices are still low. It's a big win for me because I'm able to take this new money and go buy goods at their lower prices. But as the money spreads, it has a cascading effect where the prices rise. They don't rise evenly. They rise according to the order in which the money is spread. Now, the last guy on the list, he gets this money, but now he gets the same amount of money he was previously getting, but now all the other goods that he would in turn go and buy cost more. So you don't have what we call inflation now, a general rise in prices. You have an uneven rise in prices.
Yeah.
Now, Milton Friedman, he espoused what he called the helicopter effect, that, if money was thrown from a helicopter, it spreads equally throughout the economy and all prices rise equally. That's Friedman's theory. I think it's obviously wrong. He did, of course, obviously didn't think so. It's his theory, but I think that's another reason the Austrians have an edge
Yeah.
over Friedman.
Yeah, I think so. Even the helicopter theory, it doesn't hold water in the sense that it doesn't. If new money was spread by helicopter, it wouldn't actually spread evenly.
No.
Those who could run faster would pick up more of it than those who are sitting in a wheelchair. So it's still not going to be very even. In one sense, though, I kind of wish the monetary authorities did their mischief by way of helicopter. Then we'd all see plainly. We just look up in the sky and we could see, where's all this price inflation coming from? Well, the origin is that helicopter that's dumping all this money that people value less and less. But yeah, it's an analogy, but it's a very flawed one.
Yeah. Okay. So in the 1920s, we have the President of the United States whipping up markets, with his speeches, Calvin Coolidge and what's his name, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, I believe. We also have the Fed cut interest rates, I believe, twice. I want to say in 1924 and 1926, but I'm not exactly positive. But in order to do that, they inject money into the economy. We end up with the stock market crash and the economy goes into recession. But it doesn't just stop there, right? I mean, Friedman's right. The Fed failed to act and actually act counterproductively in raising interest rates at this time. But there's this myth that Herbert Hoover just sat back and allowed laissez-faire to take, root. It just allowed it to operate. Yeah. And that's why the economy didn't recover. What actually did Herbert Hoover do during the 4 years of his presidency while we were in this Great Depression to exacerbate things? I mean,
I'm glad you've asked that, and I hope you won't mind if I just say first a quick word about Harding and Coolidge, who preceded Hoover. They actually did some good things, as did their Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, by engineering substantial cuts in tax rates throughout the 1920s. That was a very positive stimulus to the economy. I can guarantee you that if one day the government is taking 73% of my income and the next day it goes down to 24%, and that's how the top rate did change in those Harding Coolidge years, you can bet at the lower rate I'm going to be more active as an entrepreneur. So that was a good thing. But at the same time, I don't think Harding and Coolidge fully comprehended the damage that was being done simultaneously by the Federal Reserve. Murray Rothbard points out that from 1924 through 29, the Fed, at the same time good things like tax cuts were happening, the Fed was goosing up the money and credit supply, driving interest rates to record lows. Fostering things like a land boom in Florida and so forth. These were the roaring 20s, prompted by both the tax cuts, which were a good thing. I would have advocated those myself. But then the bad thing that was not sustainable was the artificial increase in money and credit. Well, Hoover got elected in 1928, of course, and takes office in March of 29. He only has a few months before the chickens come home to roost and the stock market collapses in the fall of 1929. As soon as that stock crash happened on Black Thursday in October 24, Hoover issued a statement saying the fundamental business of the country is sound. This is only a temporary correction. Things will turn around. There's nothing wrong with the fundamentals in the economy. Of course, he either didn't understand or didn't want to say that what the Fed was doing. It had been jacking up interest rates all year long, which is like taking the spiked punch away from the party. And at some point, you feel the effects of that. So Hoover had it wrong right from the start. But then on top of it, it would come 1930, he does some terrible things. In the spring of 1930, if you wind your history clock back in your mind, we didn't yet have a depression. The stock market had crashed, yeah, but by the spring, late spring of 1930, it had regained half of the ground it had lost. So that was looking halfway decent. And unemployment was only about 8.5%. That's not yet a depression. Most people would say that's a recession. But to combat this nagging unemployment and signs of a recession, Hoover, in June of 1930, signed into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised tariffs on foreign imports to all-time highs in many cases, and virtually closed the border. That shut off international trade or choked it off dramatically, prompting other governments to do the same by retaliating against American goods. And so we had a full-scale trade war. The stock market collapsed the very day he signed that into law. And by the end of the year, instead of 8.5% unemployment, we were way up into double digits, a full-scale depression. That's just the first or one of several bad things that Herbert Hoover did. He was not a laissez-faire, hands-off, stand-pat, do-nothing president. And even Franklin Roosevelt, when he campaigned against him in 1932, many times criticized Hoover for jacking up tariffs, jacking up taxes. These are his own words. He said, Herbert Hoover has presided over the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. And FDR's vice presidential candidate from Texas, John Nance Garner, he said, Hoover is taking the country down the path to socialism. Well, those criticisms were right. We didn't even mention yet the big tax increase that Hoover put into place. So that's one of the interesting things about the 1932 election. If you were a small government person in 1932, if you thought that too much government in the form of tax hikes, tariff hikes, monetary mischief, all that stuff, if you thought that was the problem, you would have voted probably for Franklin Roosevelt because he said he was going to cut federal spending by 25%. He attacked Hoover for raising taxes. I mean, he campaigned on a far more laissez-faire platform than Hoover did. And yet we know from experience that FDR didn't do any of that once he took office.
All right. So Hoover's no capitalist. He's raising taxes. He's putting in place the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Roosevelt comes into office.
Yeah.
And first of all, what does the economy look like when he first takes office? And what did he do to either help or hurt the economy?
He took office, Roosevelt did, in March of 1933. The economy was close to the bottom, as it turns out, of the Depression. Unemployment was way up beyond 20%. I think it peaked out either in late 33, maybe 34. But when it peaked out, it was in the vicinity of 27 or 28%. Roosevelt did not, from the beginning, adhere to the very things he had promised in the 1932 campaign. It turned out that he had his own bag of tricks that he wanted to impose on the economy, not because he was some economic wizard. In fact, his own financial advisor when he was governor and for the first 2 years of his presidency, James Warburg, wrote in a book in 1934 or 5 that Roosevelt didn't know any economics. And every time he went in to talk to the president about economics, he was baffled by how ignorant Roosevelt was. He just, he never had any conception of what it's like to have to pay the bills of government as a taxpayer, or, but he certainly knew how to take deductions. In fact, in 1932, the very year he's going to win the presidency, he took so many deductions on his own returns, he only paid $32 in taxes. He's a very wealthy guy from inheritance. Well, Instead, Roosevelt comes up with a whole package of stuff that he puts before the Congress. We call it the New Deal. Lots of legislation that called for all sorts of interventions in the form of price controls, destruction of crops and cattle, you name it. It was a real mess. We can talk about some of the particular laws that he put in place in the New Deal if you'd like.
Oh, sure. What I want to know is what were some of these laws?
Okay.
And what I really want you to address is how do I do this? I don't want to poison the well, but screw it. There's this argument that in 37, spending was cut, and that this led the economy to go back into a recession.
Yeah.
So I do want you to address that on top of some of the policies that you're going to tell us about.
Okay. Chronologically, let me do New Deal stuff, and then we'll get to 1937. The two big pillars of the New Deal, the most important pieces of legislation that comprise it, were the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which created a new agency called the National Recovery Administration, NRA. The idea behind this law was that the economy was suffering from too much competition. The Roosevelt people noticed that every time, or first of all, they noticed that prices had collapsed. Well, of course it's collapsing because the Federal Reserve is still contracting the money supply, as you pointed out, by at least a third from 1930 to 33. So you have collapsing prices. And the Roosevelt people think, well, every time a business gets his price up a little bit, then somebody comes along and undercuts it. We got to get American businesses singing out of the same hymn book so they all raise their prices and keep them there. And then they can make some profit and the economy will recover. So the NRA imposed industry-wide codes and price controls. Let me give you an example, a famous one. There was a New Jersey tailor who was prosecuted under the act because he pressed a suit of clothes for a customer for 35 cents instead of the code, the official mandated price of 40 cents. Now think about that. You go into a tailor and you say to the guy, hey, I have a suit here. Can you press it for me? And he says, sure, 35 cents. And then he gets prosecuted because he didn't hit you up for 40 cents. You're thinking, wait a minute, I prefer 35 cents over 40. But federal law says, no, you got to keep those prices up. Well, this simply raised the cost of doing business on average by some 40%. And the last thing you want in a depressed economy is for your costs of production to rise because you're already struggling to make a profit. Now, all of a sudden, your costs are going up because of federal mandates. So this was a ridiculous piece of legislation prompted by a stupid idea that it was competition causing the collapse in prices. It wasn't that at all. It was, Smoot-Hawley had deprived us of our agricultural export markets. So farmers got a ton of stuff they can't sell overseas. And you got the Federal Reserve slamming on the brakes and contracting the money supply, which is causing prices to fall. So at best, the NRA was treating symptoms, not dealing with actual causes, and making the whole thing worse in the process. And at the same time, the other pillar of the New Deal, the other big legislation, was the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. And there again, the Roosevelt people looked at the economy, the farm economy, and they said, look, farm prices have collapsed. Farmers are dumping milk into ditches and killing off baby chicks before raising them to maturity because prices are so low. Well, again, of course they are. Smoot-Hawley and the Federal Reserve are largely to blame for that. But the way that they wanted to treat collapsing prices was to pay farmers to have their crops destroyed. Perfectly good fields of corn, wheat, and cotton and so forth. Perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. Federal agents were sent into farmlands to supervise the destruction of those things, reducing supply, thereby raising the price. The theory was, well, if farmers can get a higher price, they'll have more money to spend. That'll stimulate the economy. But of course, the other side is they also have less to sell. And to the extent that this could have benefited the farmers, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This is redistribution through destruction. That's never a prescription for economic recovery. Fortunately, the Supreme Court eventually saved us from these two stupid New Deal laws and threw them both out as unconstitutional. Well, and Roosevelt did other things. He attacked Hoover for raising taxes, but then in his first term, he starts raising them himself. And before he's done, Roosevelt will raise the top income tax rate to well over 90%. He actually proposed a top rate of 100%, or imposed by executive order a 100% income tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. That would have been so destructive had it not been for Congress's quick intervention to kill that off and keep that from taking effect. But then in 1937, we have this big economic collapse. We never really had recovered from the Great Depression. We got a little bit of recovery in 36 after the Supreme Court killed off the NRA and the AAA. But then in 37, you have the biggest or fastest collapse in American economic history. And you're right, some Keynesian big government, big spending type economists will say, well, that's because Roosevelt cut spending. Well, in 36 and in the 37, he did a little bit, single digit percentage, but that was on top of a doubling of spending in his first term. So we were still way beyond what the federal government was spending when the economy was even healthier just 4 years before. So when people make that claim that, oh, he cut spending and that hurt us, I think they've taken their political agenda and made it their economic agenda. They're for higher taxes no matter what in many cases. But when the government spends less, that doesn't hurt the economy. It frees up resources for the private sector to put to better use than politicians can. But in any event, Roosevelt's spending cuts were short-term and very minor and hardly account for the collapse in 1937.
Okay, so Roosevelt's policies don't end the Depression. Now, some people say he rescued the economy, but they don't.
Yeah.
But there's another argument that says that it would support the Keynesian view that the thing to do during a depression is have the government spend money, right? That's the Keynesian cure. So that way because there's overproduction, people need money to go out and buy stuff, so that the government should take up the slack. The argument is that World War II was in essence a large public works project, that the government spent so much money in World War II took us out of the Great Depression. You've interestingly said that you say that the Depression ended in 1945, but even that doesn't on its own refute the idea that it was the war that got us out of the Depression. So what actually did, in your view, end the Great Depression?
Well, I know that it's commonly thought that with Pearl Harbor and American entry into the war, the Depression fairly quickly ended. And that's prompted by people who look at the unemployment rate largely and say, wow, look how the unemployment rate collapsed, went way down to single digits. We hadn't seen that since the 1920s. So therefore, the Depression was over. But the problem with that is that we drafted 11 million men into the military, sent them overseas. They didn't count anymore in the unemployment rate. So it was dramatically lower, in part because we just eliminated 11 million working men and sent them overseas. We didn't count their unemployment at home. Now you might say, well, we paid them while they were overseas. Yeah, but still, that's not the same as saying that the ordinary American saw improvement in his standard of living in the war years. We did not. If you talk about depression in terms of what's happening to the standard of living for the typical American, most Americans would have said in the war years, I'm not better off because of the war, because we had rationing, for instance. We were diverting resources, and of course we had to win the war, but it's not the same as saying we were stimulating the economy. We had to divert resources to war production, so we weren't making automobiles and refrigerators, consumer goods, things like that. And the average American during the war was actually, at best, stagnating. That's not recovery from depression, that's staying in it. We got recovery, finally, when the Keynesian economists least expected it. Keynesians love to say, as you pointed out, that when government spends less, oh, the economy's in trouble. We don't get the stimulus that we get when politicians take our money and spend it for us. I can hardly keep from laughing at that. Well, what happened was we got a 75% reduction in federal spending beginning in 1945 and into 46 and 47. 75%, biggest reduction in federal spending in American history. Almost all of it was demobilization. The war was won and it was over. And we cut spending accordingly, 75%. Now, to Keynesians, they thought, oh my gosh, if we're not going to get that stimulus. Well, we did. We got a stimulus because all of a sudden those resources were freed up for the private sector to put to better use than politicians typically can. But something else happened in 45 that helps explain the recovery. Franklin Roosevelt died in April. Harry Truman becomes president. Truman was no laissez-faire advocate for sure, but he cleaned house and got rid of some of the more radical New Dealer types. And he was persuaded by the Congress to sign into law a very dramatic reduction in business income taxes. The top rate, in one fell swoop, when Harry Truman signed the Revenue Act of 1945, the top rate on business income fell from 90% to 35%. Now, if you want to get a sense for how that is helpful, just imagine how you would react if one day the government says, you earn enough money, we're going to take 90% of it. You take all the risk, but we'll take almost all the reward. You're not going to invest. But the next day the government says, nope, now the most we'll take is 35%. Well, most people would say, oh, wow, now I can invest. I get to keep more if I'm successful. So that was a big boost to the economy in 1945. That wasn't something that Keynesians either favored or expected to happen.
All right. So is there anything that we did not cover that you think is important to cover about the Depression?
Well, I didn't mention one. There are a lot of good sources, but one in particular, authored by one of my best friends, I want to mention. If people want to know more about what the New Deal is all about, what Roosevelt was doing behind the scenes, they should read Burton Folsom's. Folsom is Folsom, his book entitled New Deal or Raw Deal. And it's a very good explanation of what Roosevelt was all about. He goes into some of the things that Roosevelt was doing with the IRS. Today there's still a lot of that FDR idolatry. Oh, what a great man he was. He saved us and so forth. Well, Folsom talks about in his book how he was manipulating the IRS to go after his enemies. In fact, you don't have to take Bert's word for it. Roosevelt's son, Eliot, wrote a book in which he said he thought his father invented the process of using the IRS to go after his political enemies. He said, we sat around the table and father was immensely interested in other people's tax returns. So, FDR was doing a lot of nasty stuff. And the bottom line was he kept us in depression. The depression lasted at least 7 years longer than it would have if not for Roosevelt's crazy and costly interventions.
Bertrand Folsom also wrote a great book called The Myth of the Robber Barons that I would highly, highly recommend. All right, Lawrence. So where can people find you and your work, of course?
I have a website where I put everything wherever it's published, usually in the blog section. The website is lawrencewreed.com, LAWRENCEWREED, lawrencewreed.com. That's the single best place.
You know, for the longest time, I thought you were Leonard Reed's son.
Oh, lots
And then I realized that the names aren't spelled the same.
I get that all the time. In fact, when I became president of FEE in 2008, I even had a phone call from an old timer who didn't know Leonard had passed away like 30 years before or 20 some years, whatever it was. Anyway, and he congratulated me for coming back to FEE as if I was Leonard.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, Lawrence, thank you so much for once again taking your time to come here and talk to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.